So we find ourselves in Leicester in the year 2023, a time and place that I'm sure we are all very familiar with. But what we're going to do is we're going to take a second to look at some of the contemporary environmental challenges that the city faces today. So Amy Wrisdale is a researcher who works on non-native species in Leicester, and she's going to help us to look at how these species first arrived and how they interact with the area's native ecologies. So Amy, do you want to come up and take us into the Anthropocene?
So the first thing we need to go through are the quiz results. For those of you who came and did the quiz, thank you very much. So I'm going to look at the questions so we can get the pictures up. So the first species that we looked at is the harlequin ladybird. This is actually an introduced species. You can distinguish it from our native ladybirds because it has a large amount of white on its face, and it sort of typically has a white triangle on its forehead. And these species have been, well, they were originally introduced in the continent and have since expanded their range to cover the UK. Our second species is the bluebell. Now this, I'm almost certain, is an English bluebell. There are currently 3 forms of bluebell that you can get in the wild in the UK. There are English bluebells, Spanish bluebells, and there's a hybrid of the 2 forms. So English bluebells typically have this kind of long tube-like shape here, whereas Spanish bluebells are a bit more of the common kind of bell or lampshade shape. And hybrid bluebells, they can be quite difficult to tell apart from the 2, as they tend to have flowers which are kind of a variation between the 2, and they can also have different variations of the flowers on the same plant. But, yeah. Our next species was the rabbit. This is an introduced species, but it's quite an early introduction. So it was thought to have been first introduced by the Romans. However, it's thought to have mainly naturalised during the Norman period, where it was introduced in larger numbers. This is a green woodpecker. This is a native species. I just thought because we were time travelling, I'd put in a bird which looks quite a bit like a dinosaur. Yep, then we have the grey squirrel. This is, I think as pretty much everyone in the quiz said, is an introduced species. This species has been predominantly known for the decline of the red squirrel by direct competition, and also the squirrel pox, which it is immune to, but the red squirrel is not. Now, this was quite a tricky one. This is one that I didn't really know until I started my PhD. This is a horse chestnut tree, and it is actually an introduced species. And yeah, I just thought that was quite interesting because everyone kind of associates conkers with when they were younger, collecting them. But yeah, they're typically found in parks and that sort of thing. And yeah, it surprised me. But they haven't had any sort of negative impact or anything. They're quite positive in total, well, in overall. Our next species was the red-legged partridge. This is an introduced species. We do have a native partridge, which is the grey partridge, but this one has red legs. And it was introduced predominantly as a game bird and is still being regularly introduced on sites where people do shooting. But yeah, it has formed its own little naturalised communities as well. Yep, next we have the blue tit. I just like them. This is a native species, but I just thought I'd add him in because he's one of my favourite garden birds. Now, this was, I think, the hardest one on the quiz, because grey-lag geese, they are native to parts of Scotland, where they typically migrate in summer to colder climates up north. However, the populations we have in England are predominantly remnants of farmyard geese. So it's a little bit of a trick question as to what you count as native and what you count as introduced. So I'm not quite sure of the answer of this one. And then our last species was the purple emperor. Some of you may recognise this from Wild Isles on Sunday, where I think it was featured. And this is a native species. It favours mature woodlands, especially oak, which is the food plant of the caterpillars. And all of these species are found in Leicestershire, so why not go out and try and find some at some point? Obviously, you'll need to wait till July for the butterflies, but other than that, I think they should all be out about now. So, getting on with the talk. Leicestershire is a heavily modified landscape, so Hannah showed you that picture of the woodlands. This is sort of the rest, which, as you can see, is predominantly farmland. So about 80% of Leicestershire is farmed, and the rest is pretty much urban and suburban. And as Hannah also mentioned, a lot of the woodlands are themselves modified, so there really isn't a lot of unmodified land left. And into this, we have introduced a range of species, some of which have had a positive impact, such as corncockles, which are these blue flowers here. These have been introduced as arable weeds, so they were accidentally introduced, but they've had a positive impact, especially in these sorts of farmland environments where pollen isn't necessarily available. However, others have had a less positive impact. For example, this is Japanese knotweed, and some of you might be aware of this from housing regulations and insurance. So part of my project is looking at whether there is a record of introduced species into Leicestershire, and more specifically if there is a preserved fossil record. Like Hannah, I'm looking at a range of proxies, for example, pollen. So this is a Himalayan balsam pollen, which is an introduced species. And I'm also looking at archaeological evidence. So these are preserved poppy seeds. This is a pig skull from Leicestershire. And we'll also be looking at things such as mollusks and beetles, which potentially have hard parts preserved as well. So just a quick definition, an invasive species is a non-native species which is known to cause damage to the environment. This damage can be done in three main ways. So you have environmental damage, which is often competition with native taxa, which can then lead to species declines and a reduction in biodiversity. You can have social impacts. For example, certain species, introduced species, have highly reactive, can be highly reactive to people with hay fever. So this can then, make the symptoms worse. And other species, such as this giant hogsweed here, it has a sap which, if it gets onto your skin, can cause quite severe chemical burns. And you can also have economic damages where species such as mussels, like these zebra mussels here, can go on to block pipes if their populations increase too much. And invasive species can spread quite rapidly. So this is an example of Himalayan balsam. This is an introduced species which favours riverbanks, which you can sort of see on this diagram here. When it all sort of loads in, you can see that it's growing in these sort of lines. And this map, if you can't read, is from the 1800s to the present day. So it's really in kind of 200 years that it's been able to spread this rapidly. And it now covers most of central England, Wales and parts of Scotland. So Leicestershire itself is home to a range of invasive species. Leicester City Council has identified 22, which it deems as a large threat to, just a large threat in the varying ways that I mentioned earlier. And each of these species has its own specific ecologies and its own interactions with the rest of the wildlife. And they've each been introduced in different ways. So in order to better understand how we can manage invasive species, it's important to first know where they were introduced, how they may have spread, and whether we are facilitating their spread. And in this way, we can hopefully prevent future invasions. There is a little bit of hope. So there is a weevil which has been classed as the wonder weevil by the government, which has been introduced into the River Soar. This is hoping to reduce the floating pennywort found in the river. And if you would like to do your bit and try to identify and record certain species, they don't need to be invasive, you could just go out and record. There are certain websites such as NatureSpot, iNaturalist, and iRecord, where you can put down any findings. And the Non-Native Species Secretariat has a number of useful ID guides for invasive species.